The 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger once famously wrote that the essence of technology is by no means anything technological. This is an enigmatic statement. You might even think it's a bit strange. How, after all, is the essence of technology not technological? Heidegger says that there are two running definitions of technology. Technology as a means to an end, the instrumental definition, and technology as a human activity, the anthropological definition. Both are true. Technology certainly is a tool used for various purposes by humans, though tool use is also widely observed in non-human animals as well. But for Heidegger, this is not the essence of technology. It's not its fundamental condition. For him, technology is more like poetry, art, and philosophy. Even before its usefulness in human endeavors, Heidegger claims that technology reveals something about us and the world, something that before had remained hidden to us. It brings forth a truth we otherwise could not know. In short, he claims, technology is a way of revealing. Heidegger's philosophy of technology aligns with the Greek word techne, which is the root of our word technology. Techne is craft and know-how, how to make and build things for various purposes. But for the Greeks, it also encompassed art and poetry. This means that everything from hammers to hot air balloons to nuclear reactors are forms of technology, but so is writing and making images. For the Greeks, and the much later Heidegger, building, writing, sculpting, and painting all reveal something about ourselves and the world. In addition, they store ideas for later use. Without these forms of technology, human history as we know it would be impossible. Neither oral history, ideas passed down through spoken words and stories, nor written history, ideas passed down through scripts and symbols, nor visual history, ideas passed down through images. Each and in their own ways are stores of information. Today, our digital devices store information in far more complex ways, but still there's a connection between the laptop I'm typing on right now and cave paintings that were made millennia ago. They both allow their users to externalize ideas and concepts. Around the same time as Heidegger, one of the first media theorists, Marshall McLuhan, claimed something similar. He wrote that media and technology are extensions of the human mind and body. In other words, that they allow us to do things and go places we otherwise wouldn't be able to do ourselves. McLuhan also teaches us that media and technology condition our very human existence in a feedback loop. The things we create end up creating us. So just think of the dopamine hits that come with digital interfaces and social media and the way this shapes our brains and attention spans, or how spell checkers have completely ruined my ability to spell the spell checker in Word or over text. We're going to think of technology in similar ways in this session. Art and artists revealing something about the world that was not clear before they made their works, and which allows human culture to extend itself and evolve with technological dependence. The word calligraphy comes from the Greek word kalos and graphe, which translates to beautiful writing. And I couldn't agree more when it comes to Chinese calligraphy. Nearly throughout the long, continuous history of China, calligraphers have been deemed to be some of the most regarded and important artists, and had to undertake years of rigorous training. One of the amazing aspects of Chinese characters is that their execution in calligraphy, in other words, the way the marks are made and drawn, changes or adds to the meaning. The more perfect the mark of the character, it was thought, the more clear and perfect the meaning. They're also going to change according to the circumstance. So poetry and administrative texts, like bureaucratic texts, might use some of the same words, but their characters will be expressed in different ways. Gifted calligraphers can modulate everything from the width and length of the characters to the amount of ink on the silk or paper. Often important rulers themselves would be calligraphers, adding to their cultural refinement and prestige. And in fact, calligraphy was thought to reveal the moral fiber and discipline of an individual, which is very much in line with the Confucian ideas of self-cultivation we spoke about last session. One of the earliest and most esteemed Chinese calligraphers was Wang Zhixi. He lived in the 4th century Common Era during the Jin dynasty, when calligraphy really came into its own as cultural import. He was a governing official and poet. And the work you're seeing here is one of his letters, though I think his most famous work is another piece of calligraphy called Orchid Pavilion Preface, which a later Tang Dynasty emperor liked so much that he asked to be buried with it. And this is probably why it's now lost to history. But we do have copies of it, and it's really amazing. Google if you have a chance. The seals on the letter you're seeing now, which are made from cut stones designed by Stamps, are personal symbols, not only that of the artist, but also those who subsequently own this work. So over time, seals of owners and collectors build up on this page, a historical keeping of records, which includes 2 emperors from the Qin dynasty in the 18th and 19th centuries. So why are we looking at calligraphy as our first example in this session on technology? For one thing, the coordination between mind, eye, hand, and brush attests to a technological relationship of incredible control and precision. In Heidegger's terms, it reveals a truth about these relationships. For another, since this calligraphy is done on paper, it also attests to one of the inventions that are commonly referred to as China's 4 great inventions, and they are the compass, gunpowder, papermaking, and printing. And can you even imagine world history without these 4 inventions? The history of exploration, war, information, even history itself would likely be very different without them. The Ming Dynasty perfected another key Chinese invention, though it was actually invented during the previous Tang Dynasty, porcelain. This invention is so synonymous with China that in West, the lowercase English word China means dishes made by the ceramic technique. And we've already mentioned porcelain when we traveled on the Silk Road a little while back. It was a hot commodity along those trade routes. It was discovered that if you heat kaolin clay to extremely high temperatures, along with a certain type of feldspar mineral, something special happens. It becomes smooth and translucent. In fact, Ming is not a family name like some of the other dynasties, but the Chinese word for luminous or shining. This technique also allowed the ceramicist to fire pigment directly into the object. This is called underglaze painting. The mineral cobalt, which today is essential for so many of our electronics, was a popular pigment in West Asia, resulting in a deep and lustrous blue. We see this in these 2 gorgeous Ming flasks that are in the museum collection today. The flask on the left shows a finely detailed cobalt blue dragon, scales, eyes, talons, and all, against a white airy background filled with regular vegetal patterns. The flask on the right shows us the same dragon, but in negative. Here you see the white silhouette of the dragon against the blue cobalt background of beautifully textured waves. At the bottom, you can even see cresting waves. So these definitely come as a pair. They visually represent opposites like air and water. They might also represent yin and yang, which is an important dualistic force in Chinese cosmology. Yin is the passive receptive principle, while yang is the active principle, and both are needed for world creation and transformation. It's possible then that the round porcelain on the left is evocative of yang, with the actively depicted dragon, while the one on the right is evocative of yin, with its silhouette of a dragon that's waiting to be filled in a way. What's for sure is that dragons are incredibly important across Chinese philosophies and traditions. They're metaphors for the awe-inspiring forces of nature. They stand in for important rulers and sages. During the Han Dynasty, dragons even became the symbol of the Chinese Empire. And in Chan Buddhism, they're figures of enlightenment. So really important polyvalent symbols in Chinese history. We change course now, and I want to mention a funny scene in Monty Python's film Life of Brian from 1979. It's one of the many funny scenes. It's set in Palestine during the Roman Empire, and political dissidents are sitting around complaining about the empire and its occupation. During one of their secretive meetings, one of the leaders asks the rhetorical question, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" What ensues is the joke itself, since the followers in the room start listing all the things the Romans indeed have given them: roads, medicine, irrigation, sanitation, laws, wine, and so many other things. Some of this may be historically inaccurate, but the scene does get to a key aspect of the Roman Republic and subsequent empire. Like China and other important civilizations around the world, we continue to use Roman technologies. They've indelibly shaped the course of human history. And one of the very famous examples of the Romans giving the people something is the Colosseum, also known as the Flamen Amphitheater, after the family name of the new lineage of emperors after the disastrous rule of Nero. You may have heard that Rome was burning during Nero's rule, and that's true, but that he played the fiddle while it burned probably is not. Vespasian, the new emperor after Nero, decided to build the Colosseum as an offering to appease the Romans. It's the progenitor of today's massive sports arenas, and in fact our word arena comes from the Latin word for sand. The entertainment area of the Colosseum was filled with sand, which helped sop up the blood from all the gladiators, animals, slaves, and religious minorities, especially Christians, whose deaths were central to the violence on display. It could fit some 50,000 spectators, and beneath the Colosseum was a complex system of pulleys and compartments that kept the entertainment in check, especially the wild animals. It's 159 feet high, the equivalent of a 15-story building. It had a retractable awning on hot or rainy days, and the seats were tiered according to class and social importance. And as you might guess, the closer you were, the more important you were, while the less important were up in the nosebleeds. The Colosseum was completed by Vespasian's brother, the Emperor Titus, who we've already met in this class, and was inaugurated in 80 Common Era. It's said that when it opened, there were 100 days straight of games, fights, and other spectacles, including a flooding of the arena and a reenactment of a naval battle with ships and everything. In the context of our session today, this amphitheater is clearly a feat of engineering. Of course, today it's in ruins. All the marble that would have lined the inside, the seating areas, was repurposed later on in Rome's history for various other building projects. The key innovation from the ancient Romans, though, is still really visible: concrete. Concrete is a mixture of broken pieces of stone and a binding agent, which is called cement. This cement binding agent is sometimes made of lime, but the Romans used a volcanic sand that was mined in the nearby city of Naples. Unlike bricks and mortar, concrete is much more flexible a building material. It can be shaped and span larger distances, creating more space and architectural possibilities. So think back to the Pantheon from a few sessions ago. That wouldn't have been possible as a building without concrete. It's also stronger and more durable. Lastly, it's easier to work with and takes less skill, which allowed it to expand even more as a building material. Another key innovation of Roman architecture and engineering is the Roman arch. In fact, the basic building block of the Colosseum that you're seeing here is the Roman arch. It's an inverted U shape, and it goes all around all three levels. Many centuries later, around the turn of the first millennium, scholars started noticing in Europe that Christian churches began reincorporating this Roman arch into their architecture, into churches. Because of this, they called this period the Romanesque period, fittingly enough, which lasted roughly from 1000 to 1150 Common Era. And so here is a schematic of the Roman arch, which was used during ancient times and the Romanesque period. The one on the right is a barrel vault. The one on the left is a barrel vault, which is simply a continuous row of Roman arches, while the one on the right is a groin vault, which is basically two Roman arches fused together perpendicularly at right angles. But then, during the Gothic period, which comes just after the Romanesque in Europe, architects began using a much more flexible arch design with a pointed top. This too can be configured into a barrel and groin vault, which is what you're seeing in this diagram here. This is the Gothic Arch, and it's responsible for the key architectural innovations of the Gothic cathedrals. I should mention, though, that the Sasanian Empire in present-day Iran and Muslim masons elsewhere already developed a pointed arch like this, and we'll often find this in the study of Western history, that it's been influenced and is often indebted to non-Western sources. In any case, there are two main reasons why the Gothic arch is superior to the Roman. First, the arch shape is not a prescribed U shape, but an inverted V. which can swivel at the top for different angles and positions. The Gothic arch can be used to straddle different lengths and can shoot up higher into the sky. The second reason has to do with gravity and bearing weight. The Roman arch, especially if you scale it up real big, creates a tension and weight that wants to push on the sides of the structure. Then the center of the U, the upside down U, also pushes downward more at its center. Because of this, Romanesque churches had to be really fortified. They're really thick and look more like military fortresses. The Gothic arch, on the other hand, creates a tension and weight that leads to a downward thrust, straight down. And the sharper its angle at the top, the less weight is pushed to its sides of the walls. And so this allowed architects to build thinner and thinner churches and higher churches. The lighter load bearing also allowed for more space and windows, especially for those amazing rose-colored windows that Gothic cathedrals are so famous for. And so here's one of the great cathedrals in France. It's at Chartres. Like the well-known cathedral in Paris that sadly almost burned down to the ground in 2019, it's also called Notre Dame, which means Our Lady. The lady in question, of course, is Mary, and for Christians, it's said that her tunic is housed in this structure, in this church, the very tunic she was wearing when giving birth to Jesus. This would be the holiest relic in the church for Christians, which pilgrims would visit from far away and pray to and venerate. We're seeing it from the outside on a bright, sunny day. The spires shoot up into the sky, and to this day it still dominates the skyline of the city of Chartres. It's so massive that it's difficult to photograph. So here's a floor diagram to get the sense of its shape and totality. There are two terms I'd like you to know. You'll notice that, fittingly enough for a Christian structure, it's essentially in the shape of a cross. The short side of the cross is called the transept. It intersects with the longer side of the cathedral, which is called the nave. The nave is completely an open space, and I can tell you as a little kid who grew up in France and visited these places, it really is an amazing structure to walk into. And so again, photographs don't do it justice, as is so often the case with art objects, but especially architecture. But here is an approximation. Notice how high the ceiling is. And notice how it employs those Gothic arches we just talked about, and they're configured as groin vaults. It's also called rib vaulting, which makes sense because it almost looks like a rib cage running along the ceiling. Notice also the thinness of the design, which makes room for stained glass windows that allow this incredible light to come through the space. And there's another key architectural component and innovation that allowed builders to build like this. Let's take a look at the outside again. Do you see that what basically look like arms shooting up from the ground and attaching themselves to the outside of the building? Those are called flying buttresses. They too allowed for higher and higher construction with thinner and thinner walls that could then allot more stained glass windows inside of the church and the cathedral. The key figure during this period was Abbot Suger, who commissioned Gothic-style renovations to the church at Saint-Denis near Paris, and this is the church where French kings would be buried. He was especially interested in the light that could pour through stained glass windows, coloring the inside of the space with the whole spectrum. He called this Lux Nova, or new light, and claimed that once the light enters the church through the stained glass, it's no longer ordinary everyday light. It's become transubstantiated into divine or holy light. Chartres Cathedral contains one of the most well-known stained glass windows that emanates this sort of light. It's known as the rose window with lancets. The rose is the round flower-like design above. The lancets are the longer designs below. Since the cathedral is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, it makes sense that this rose window and lancets depict her. She's in the middle of the rose holding a baby Christ figure. Around her are angels, doves, and other holy figures. In the middle lancet below her is Saint Anne, Mary's mother. The lancet on either side of Anne are important Old Testament prophets, who you'll remember prefigure the Christian story of Mary and Jesus in the New Testament. And the fact that this window is still there for us to see today, with its diffuse multicolored light, is really a testament to the engineering skill of these Gothic architects. During the 15th century and the Renaissance in Florence, Italy, painters began to use one of the key technical innovations of Western painting: linear perspective. With the help of Arabic thinkers, like the 11th century mathematician Alhazen, who made key discoveries in optics and human perception, the multi-talented Filippo Brunelleschi developed the workings of linear perspective, while Leon Battista Alberti wrote down the rules in his treatise called Della Pittura, or On Painting. Last session we talked about atmospheric perspective, which uses color and shading to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. Linear perspective also adds the illusion of depth, but through more precise geometric means that unify the picture with precise coordinates. The Florentine painter Perugino and his painting Delivery of the Keys to St. Peter is essentially a lesson in linear perspective. To see how, it's helpful to superimpose a diagram over this painting. And the basic setup goes like this. You have a horizon line, which runs horizontally along the picture. On this horizon line, you'll find the vanishing point, where everything in the picture leads. If there's one point, it's called single point perspective, but there can be more than one, like in 2-point perspective. In the case of Perugino's painting here, it's in single point perspective, and the vanishing point is located in the dead center of the painting. Then, all the lines that lead from the front of the painting to the vanishing point are called the orthogonals. Everything in the image, from the figures to the buildings to the ground itself, is ordered according to these orthogonals, which create a unified visual field of recession into space, theoretically infinite space at the vanishing point. This is the original virtual reality, by which a two-dimensional space appears, at least to our eyes, as having 3 dimensions. Coupled with atmospheric perspective, linear perspective was a powerful tool for painters, and it drove the history of Western painting. That is, until someone like Paul Cézanne came along in the late 19th century to break everything down. But that's for next session. Another key development is printing, which we've already mentioned as one of the 4 great Chinese inventions. There are a number of different printing techniques, for example, woodblock printing or engraving. In each case, the artist will prepare a drawing that will then be transferred to a printing material. A piece of wood in the case of woodblock printing, or a piece of copper in the case of engraving. A piece of paper is then run through a press with the wood or copper plate that has been inked, resulting in the copy of the artist's original design. In the case of the woodblock, the ink goes on the positive, like a stamp, which then marks the paper. In the case of engraving, the ink goes on the negative, inside the grooves and incisions made into the copper plate. And when the paper is pressed through the press, it dips into the incised copper plate, resulting in the image. While these are the practical aspects of printmaking, I think the more interesting part of these techniques are their effects on the history of the public sphere, on society, on us. Printing is key for the first information revolution, and the second we're currently living through, which is the digital. When Gutenberg developed his famous printing press, all of a sudden texts and images that were usually reserved for the wealthy and powerful, like royalty and the church, began to be available to many more people. Martin Luther around this time will translate the Bible, the Christian Bible, from Latin into vernacular German, which will allow the lay public to read scripture for themselves for the first time without being dependent on the clergy. And this is a key aspect of the Protestant Reformation, which we've talked about in previous sessions. Books, once a super luxury object, could now be owned by an emerging middle class. New social and political ideas could be spread far and wide. This was the beginnings of what the historian Benedict Anderson has called the imagined community, a group of individuals in society that come together by reading the same media and may never even meet in person. Of course, this information revolution also fundamentally changed the reception of art. Whereas before only the wealthy and powerful could own paintings, or really images of any kind, now through printmaking, artists could make copies of their works on paper, selling them more cheaply and distributing them more widely. An artist who would become famous for his prints was Albrecht Dürer. He was an accomplished painter of the 16th century Northern Renaissance, and Dürer actually did really well for himself through his prints, more so than his paintings, which became incredibly popular with the public. His 1504 engraving of Adam and Eve, which you're seeing here, is one such print. It's one of the first depictions of the nude body since antiquity, and is clearly indebted to classical Greek sculpture, especially the figure of Adam on the left. I mean, it is the Renaissance after all. The level of detail in this engraving is spectacular. Though it's in black and white, notice how the bark of the trees read differently than the skin of Adam and Eve. This is largely due to Durer's very technique of shading and modulating the light source. You'll also probably notice a few animals in this image. Way off in the distance on the top right is a ram or a goat looking over a cliffside, probably in reference to the story of Abraham and Isaac. On a branch is a parrot next to a sign that says Albrecht Dürer made this. The parrot is likely an allusion to mimicry and imitation. For Dürer, of course, Adam and Eve were made by the Christian God. So for him to say that he made Adam and Eve would be sacrilegious, if not for this visual pun of a parrot, a bird that purportedly only mimics human speech in a pale imitation. As it turns out, this isn't true. Parrots really do use human language and know what they're saying. Just look up Alex the Parrot on YouTube for a famous example. In any case, Dürer is making an analogy here. His print is also a pale imitation of the divine creation. Then there are the animals in the forest. There's a cat, there's a rabbit, there's an elk, and an ox. This is in reference to a pre-scientific understanding of human anatomy that was current during the Renaissance, but actually it goes all the way back to medical thinking in antiquity, especially in the work of Hippocrates, where we get the term Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm. The theory was that we have 4 different types of liquids, which are called humors, that course through our bodies: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Each humor is responsible for our well-being and the tenor of our emotions. If everything is in perfect balance and harmony, as it was in the biblical account of the Garden of Eden, at least before the eating of the forbidden fruit and original sin, then we're healthy. If a humor goes out of whack, however, then we feel the effects. And these humors were often represented by animal stereotypes, some of which we don't really use anymore today, at least I don't think. For example, too much blood humor, and we become frisky and overly friendly like a rabbit. Too much phlegm, and we become tired and lazy like an ox. Too much yellow bile, and we're prone to anger like a standoffish cat. And too much black bile, and we get depressed like an elk. And this last one is funny to me. I never knew elks were associated with sadness or melancholy. In a way, this is a mechanistic view of the human body. The body is a machine that needs to stay in balance for it to work properly. Okay, so if printmaking was a revolutionary social medium, as we've just discussed, then the next technological breakthrough might be even more consequential: the invention of photography. It had long been known by Chinese, Arabic, and Greek thinkers that if you have a darkened box or a darkened room with a small pinhole or hole opening, on the side opposite of the pinhole inside, an image of the outside world will appear, at least inverted and upside down. So you're seeing that here in this diagram. This is called the camera obscura. It can be very large or very small, like a pinhole camera. Leonardo da Vinci was fascinated by it, and the painter Vermeer may have used it to create his paintings, his highly realistic paintings. But the thing is, even though this principle of light and image in a box had been known for centuries, no one was able to figure out how to fix the image. In other words, how to permanently take the image out of the box, out of the camera obscura, so to see it in the light of day and the gallery. This all changed in the 1820s and the 1830s. Independently of each other, the Frenchman Louis Daguerre and the Englishman William Henry Fox Talbot both figured out a way of fixing their image that they made with light. Daguerre announced his invention in 1839, but generously chose not to patent it, declaring it free for the world to use. This prompted Talbot to give lectures and announce his own invention that he had been working on at the same time. This story of the origins of photography is always presented as a competitive one, and indeed Talbot did try to get recognized as the first inventor. In truth, though, their respective photographic processes are a bit different, so let's start with Daguerre's. Daguerre discovered that certain chemicals reacted in such a way that exposing them to light registered images of the outside world. He used silver-coated copper plates that were polished to a high mirror-like sheen, which were then treated with iodine fumes. These would be exposed for 20 to 30 minutes. You should know that early photographic techniques had very long exposure times, which is why anything that moved didn't show up in the image. You had to sit very still for a long period of time to have your portrait taken in a studio in those days. Then, treating the exposed silver plate with mercury vapors, an image of the world in the mirror-like plate would emerge. To fix this image, he bathed the plate in a salt solution. This technique Daguerre named after himself, the Daguerreotype. It became the most popular form of early photography and quite commercially successful. The one you're seeing here is from 1837, 2 years before the announcement of his invention, and it's an image of his studio. Although it's a novel technology, notice that Daguerre arranged the scene to look like a still life, a traditional still life. In this way, he sought to confirm its status as art, though actually it would take a long time for photography to be considered a proper art form. And maybe just an interesting question and aside, why do you think that's the case? While Daguerre was working on his technique in France, up north in England, Talbot was experimenting with his own early photographic process. It's often said that Talbot was brilliant at many things, but the one thing he definitely was not good at was drawing. And this bothered him, which is what led him to his photographic discoveries. He thought, why can't nature do the drawing for me? He experimented with paper chemically treated with silver chloride in a camera box. These would result in negative images that he discovered, independently of Daguerre, could be fixed through a chemical process. He called his invention the Callitype. You'll remember the same Greek prefix in the word calligraphy, kalos meaning beautiful, so Callitype translates to beautiful image. The great benefit of Talbot's technique is the negative, which can be used to make multiple copies and other photographs. By contrast, the daguerreotype was a positive image, making it a unique photograph that can't be reproduced into other photographs. So while Daguerre's invention was initially more popular and successful, ultimately the history of analog photography, which uses negatives, begins with Talbot's Callitype. In 1844 and 46, he published a collection of his photographs in a book called The Pencil of Nature. This photograph, The Open Door, was part of this collection in the book. The pencil is essentially light, which frees up the hand from having to do any of the drawing. It also presents a more objective view of the world, since the subjective aspects of the human mind and hand don't intervene as much as they do in something like drawing or painting. In some way, the world is revealing itself through light and chemicals. It's bearing witness to itself. Just think of how consequential these inventions have been for human history since, not only for science, but also for society and politics. Though our cameras today are usually digital, we carry these around in our pockets, ready to reproduce what we see with our phones, from artworks in museums to what we had for lunch to violence and injustices in the world. Like the invention of printing, photography has been really revolutionary for human history. One of the first architectural structures to prominently display modern technology is the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France. It was built by Gustave Eiffel for the 1889 World's Fair, which coincided with the 100-year anniversary of the French Revolution. At 1,603 feet high, it was the largest structure in the world. That is, until 1930, 41 years later, when the Chrysler Building in New York took the #1 spot, but was quickly surpassed by the Empire State Building. The Eiffel Tower was a daring construction made of wrought iron that almost shows you how it was made. You can see the lattice work, you can see through its parts, and you can see how everything joins up. When it was first made, its newness was disliked by much of the public. And this probably goes to show that sometimes technology outpaces public taste. Today, it's the most visited monument in the world with an entrance fee, and Paris really wouldn't be the same without the Eiffel Tower. Around the same time, there was a technological revolution happening at the level of labor and production. Frederick Taylor wrote his Principles of Scientific Management, which was first published in 1911. He showed how dividing individual tasks to individual workers in the factory sped up production and made it more efficient. Workers also didn't need to be trained as much, since they repeated only one menial task, one thing, for hours on end. Along with the assembly line of Henry Ford, this fundamentally changed the workplace and the way economic production happened. It might sound strange today, but some artists were fascinated by Taylorism, and his vision of a regimented and ordered workplace. We see this in the French painter Fernand Léger, who privileged a highly rational and ordered form of painting. It's as if production and technological advances entered the history of painting with Léger. This is his three women, who appear to be made up of plastic modular parts, where their bodies are standardized as if made on an assembly line. You can mix and match their eyes, faces, hair, and limbs, and not really notice the difference. You might be able to say the same thing about everything else in the room: the couch, the cat, the tables, and the tubing. Léger had complete faith in technological process. The truth is, this development in painting was just off the heels of the traumas of World War I, which is often referred to as the first modern war, with its trench warfare and other firsts in military technology. So, for example, gas warfare. Artists like Léger, not to mention the public, were reassured by such a clean and highly rational form of painting after the war's chaotic devastation in Europe. There's even a historical term for this, which happened throughout the 1920s, just after the war, and that's called the return to order. Another key development in the 20th century was the invention of video. One of the pioneers of using video art, along with all manner of technologies and electronics, was Nam June Paik. He was born in Korea but had to fled the Korean War with his family when he was young, going to Hong Kong and Japan, then to Germany to study music, classical music, and finally coming to New York. I highly recommend checking out some of his works from the 1960s and 70s. There are so many good examples. This one, Electronic Superhighway, Continental US, is a much more recent example from 1995. It's made up of 336 television sets, 3,750 feet of cable, and 575 multicolor neon tubes. Everything is turned on in this cacophonous installation of images and lights. You'll notice that the neon tubing outlines all the different states, from California to Texas to Maine to Florida. Paik has carefully chosen what the screens play on a loop so that they correspond to his preconceived notions of that state. So, for example, Kansas is playing the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. Idaho is filled with images of potatoes, naturally. And Alabama features speeches from the great civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., where he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. By the 1950s, television sets began to appear in many people's homes in this country, which created another version of Anderson's imagined community, of everyone watching the same things together, though are usually physically apart and largely unknown to each other. Like the printing press, this fundamentally changed the public sphere. I think that other than certain shows, maybe on Netflix, it's hard for us today to conceive of a time where everyone watched the same programs and received the same information on the evening news. Our imagined community today is far more fragmented. And actually, we may no longer even have an imagined community, but countless imagined communities that live in their own online bubbles. Finally, we can't have a session on technology and not mention the more recent artists using software and the internet to make art. There are lots of great examples of this. This one is by the Chinese video game designer Genova Chen and the Venezuelan video game designer Kelly Santiago. In 2007, they designed a video game together as an artwork called Flower. I really like its simplicity, along with the fact that it has an environmental theme and isn't in any way violent or graphic. So for this session, I'm going to leave you with a clip of this game and someone explaining it. There really is no other way to show how it works or what it looks like.
Flower stands apart from almost every contemporary game in its genre. Designer Genova Chen described it as an interactive poem that explores the tension between nature and urban environments. The player becomes the wind, breathing life back into the world by flying through flowers strewn across the landscape. With every flower reached, more petals join the wind to create a vibrant dance of color. The original idea for Flower was inspired by Chen's move from Shanghai to California. Growing up in a sprawling urban center, he had never experienced the green rolling hills that he saw on the West Coast. He wanted to develop a game that would give players the same experience, allowing them to bring nature into their homes in an interactive way. Playing Flower inspires peace, wonder, joy, freedom, and even sadness in a way that no video game has ever done before.